Both Governor Weld and I are alums of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, though not the Kennedy School. I must say Governor Weld was many years before me. We didn't serve together. But it's good to see you here tonight. And it's a pleasure to be here at the Kennedy School with the Governor, Commissioner Jeff Riley, our distinguished panelists, and all of you in the audience to discuss charter public schools in Massachusetts. In particular, I'm pleased to participate in this event launching Kara Stillings-Candel's excellent book about education policy lessons from the Commonwealth's nation-leading charter schools. She's really done a tremendous job researching and writing this important book, which is called The Fight for the Best Public Charter Schools in the Nation. I commend this book to you, and if you're interested in charter schools in Massachusetts, I think it's a book you really ought to buy. You must get it. In many ways, it's appropriate that we're here at the Kennedy School because so many people of my generation, especially lifelong Democrats like me, were positively inspired to go into public service by President Kennedy and by that famous line from his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Perhaps more than we know, JFK's calls to public service helped inform our understanding of the common good that influenced the 1993 Education Reform Act, which Governor Weld, Representative Mark Roosevelt, and I worked together on. This year, education reform in Massachusetts is celebrating its 25th anniversary, and the historic results this law has produced truly have exceeded our hopes for what might be possible for Bay State students. I remember that stifling hot day when Governor Weld signed the Education Reform Act into law at the unair-conditioned homeschool in Malden. If you had told me back then that more than 90% of our students would pass MCAS, that we would have 13 consecutive years of improvement on the SAT, that our students would rank first or near first in the nation in every category and every grade tested on NAEP between 2005 and 2017, and that they would place at or near the top on gold standard international math and science tests like the TIMSS, I would have thought you were unrealistically optimistic. We all had ambitious hopes for education reform on that day 25 years ago, but I doubt that any of us would have dared to predict the extraordinary successes we have actually enjoyed under the Act. For all its complexity, the Education Reform Act can essentially be reduced to two core principles. We're going to make a massive infusion of state dollars into our public schools, and in return, we expect high standards and accountability from all education stakeholders. That was the grand bargain of ed reform. This large investment of state resources to support higher academic standards, accountability, and school choices like Voc Tech and charter schools were key contributors to our successes. As Kara's book articulates so well, no group of public schools has been more controversial or more successful than our outstanding charter schools. Growing up in Chelsea, having a chance to attend Harvard and Oxford, and being an urban legislator, I helped establish charters in order to give poor and minority families access to something resembling the high-quality school choices the affluent have long enjoyed. And of course, the main reason why Massachusetts charters have accumulated a 30,000 student wait list is because for 20 years they have successfully bridged race and class-based achievement gap. For example, more than a decade of studies from Harvard, MIT, Duke, and Stanford have repeatedly shown that our charters close more than 90% of the achievement gap between rich and poor kids, making them the best public schools in the country at ending these persistent disparities. Kara's book is also very clear that a major factor in Massachusetts' success with chartering has been that we've taken seriously the grand bargain of charter school policymaking itself, greater school autonomy in exchange for strict accountability for delivering outstanding results for kids. Given the heated debates aroused by chartering, okay isn't good enough. To be defensible, charters need to exceed the performance of the traditional public schools, and in Massachusetts, they largely have. As somebody who co-authored the education reform law that established charter schools, I have to note that the Senate version had no cap on charters. But the legislative process and politics resulted initially in a cap of 25 charters, which has been lifted legislatively on 3 occasions. This limit has actually made chartering here much more rigorous and demanding than it would have been had the number been unlimited. The discipline with which the Commonwealth has authorized charters and the fact that we've not been shy about revoking the charters of low-performing schools, I believe, has greatly contributed to the overall success of Massachusetts charter schools. The charter schools were created by the legislature, and the caps were previously lifted by the legislature, a reason why, even as a charter supporter, I was skeptical about the 2016 ballot initiative to modestly expand the allowable number of charters. That both sides to this electoral debate spent over $20 million each to fight this topic tells you how controversial and how hotly contested charter policy remains, even 25 years after the Education Reform Act. CARA doesn't shy away from addressing the failure of the ballot effort and the policy lessons we should learn from it. This is why CARA's book and events like this one are so vitally significant to our democracy. Having a public forum where people of differing views can rationally debate and discuss key, difficult public policies is so important and perhaps even necessary, especially in this hyper-divided and contentious era of ours. We need never lose sight of how fortunate we are here in Massachusetts, not just because of the success of education reform and the opportunities our charter schools have afforded the neediest students, but also due to our long-term commitment to academic excellence and educational equity. But as JFK wrote, "For of those to whom much is given, much is required. And when at some future date the High Court of History sits in judgment on each of us, recording whether in our brief span of surface we fulfilled our responsibilities to the state, our success or failure in whatever office we hold will be measured. As a matter of basic justice and the equality of educational opportunity that is a birthright in this Commonwealth, we owe it to urban families and policymakers across the country to be that shining city upon a hill that our forefathers envisioned, and to share the hard-won lessons and successes of education reform efforts, including charter schools." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Elected to Massachusetts Corner Office in 1990 and re-elected handily in 1994, Governor Weld was a rare political leader, one who could master any topic and at the same time quote Thucydides in Greek. In office, he was a stalwart proponent of K-12 education reform based on high-quality academics and school choice. Based on results, he too is among the very best governors in K-12 education reform in our era. Weld's successes also included tax reforms, a balanced budget, and policy changes that strongly supported job growth and business growth. Today, Governor Weld is a member and principal at ML Strategies with Mintz Levin, and before that practiced law in the New York and Washington offices of a large international law firm. He's the author of 2 novels and graduated with an A.B. summa cum laude from Harvard College, studied economics at University College, Oxford, and graduated with a J.D. cum laude from Harvard Law School. Governor.
Thank you very much, Jim. I did study at Oxford, but I missed the roads, doubtless owing to a clerical error. So Tom is right. It was a grand bargain, the whole 1993 education reform law, and I had 2 of those in my tenure as governor. And the reason I love them so much and call them grand bargains is because I got what I wanted on both sides of the deal in both cases. One of them was in December 1994, right after my first term ended. And I traded with legislative leadership, not then including President Birmingham, so they shall be nameless, a zeroing out of the long-term capital gains tax, something I very much wanted, in exchange for me supporting a hefty, almost, it wasn't quite 100% raise, but a hefty raise in the salary for legislators, which I, along with Barney Frank, I also supported, because having been a longtime federal prosecutor, I thought a $26,000 starting salary in the legislature was frankly an invitation to corruption. So we raised it to, I forget, 47 or something like that, but I got a lot of kisses from the wives at the Christmas party that year. So that was issue number one, where I got both halves. The other one, as Senate President Birmingham mentioned, is the ed reform law. And I had been kind of thinking about funding before we even got to the table. And I frankly, my dirty little secret is that underneath it all, in a lot of ways, on a lot of issues, I'm a liberal, but don't tell anybody. But so I was reading about the enormous disparities in spending between Wellesley and Weston on the one hand, $25,000 if memory serves, and Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, the black areas, Area B of Boston, $6,000 in 1991. And I recall reading with favor a case in the New Jersey Supreme Court really rattling the saber about maybe the court's going to have to step in and take over this thing. So I told my staff, when I floored them by saying I'm in for the funding, that I'd rather do it myself than have some judge tell me to do it, even apart from the moral imperative. And one thing a governor does do is go around to a lot of different schools, and you really can see, you know, there were classes of 12, there were classes of 38 with a lot of noise. So not a good learning environment. So that part of it was pretty easy for me. In return, we wanted, you know, we thought of them as management givebacks, but they really were, as Tom said, accountability. And I recall early on, there was ferocious resistance to the charter schools because people said, well, you're giving them all these perks. You know, they're not subject to all these same rules. What if they don't do a good job? And thus was born our crusading slogan, freedom to fail. We thought it was very important for charter schools to have freedom to fail, and that was Republican orthodoxy, I guess, creeping through. And 5 or 7 have failed, and I agree with the Senate President. I think that's been good. It's good tonic for everybody else. So the main thing we got in return for all our money, and fortunately by that time we had a fair amount of money. I don't think that law would have been possible in 1991 when you and I were both elected, because the state was flat on its back as a result of the recession of 1991. But because of our wise fiscal policy, read 21 tax cuts in a row and no tax increases, the floodgates opened and the Treasury was swimming with cash. So we were able to make that bargain with the teachers union and get high stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 10th grade, with penalties for not passing those tests, i.e. retention in the same grade, and an end to social promotion. And I was called the biggest racist in Massachusetts because in some of the lower performing inner school districts, if you were a black resident of one of those 3 areas of Boston I referred to, and you got to 12th grade, you were getting a pass no matter what. Nobody was held back after getting into 12th grade. And the result of that was a lot of these kids, through, I would say, no fault of their own, but rather an inattentive training at that stage of their education, they'd arrive at community college and they would flunk remedial English and remedial math. And the community college presidents weren't too keen about having a flood of students coming in who really couldn't do the work. So I thought that was a good thing as well. And accountability really was the name of the game in terms of what we got on our side of the education reform law. So we did suffer a blow, a setback a couple of years ago. I was surprised. I was busy with other things that year, I guess, but so we were not able to lift the cap again. We were just reminiscing. In the early years when we started out, nobody was really watching the charter schools, and I, Tom will remember this, got to give free real estate to the charter schools. Try that today and see what kind of ruckus that would raise. But they've done a great job, and but I think it's important to stress, as Tom and I did in a piece we wrote recently, that as long as the conditions that led to the creation of charter schools continue to exist, we can't take no for an answer, and we got to go back to the bench on that and keep trying to lift those numbers. The spending differences have crept back in, and last year Weston spent $24,000 per student, and Brockton spent, well, less than $15,000. So we made some. Nobody's down there at 6 or 8, but we've made some progress. But you know, that kind of discrepancy is simply not acceptable, even at a 50% ratio, in addition to a 25% ratio. So we have opined that the one thing that the legislature might well do is eliminate the requirement that you have to have proven success in order to take over a charter school in one of these underperforming districts, because we think that stifles innovation, and which has been a hallmark of charter schools, and innovation like strict standards and accountability was a hallmark of the statute as a whole. I'd like to introduce a curveball which you might not on first blush think has anything to do with charter schools, but I think it does. I've been spending a certain amount of my time, not in law practice, but in serving other organizations on artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, and automated vehicles. And a year or two ago, there was widespread panic in the United States that 50% of the workers in the United States were going to lose their jobs by 2040 because of these new technologies taking over. And I got reasonably deeply into it, and I think people are kind of cooling off on that. But and now the settled wisdom is more that maybe 1/3 to 1/6 of our workers in the United States are going to have different jobs by 2030, but not that they're necessarily going to lose their jobs. But there is something that has to be done in order for them not to lose those jobs, and that's for them to have the skill sets that the new jobs will require. And the evidence is very clear that the new jobs are going to require more than a high school education, and they're going to require skill sets that many people, myself included, do not possess, such as advanced digital skills, customer relationship management, and things that can be taught, but need to be taught in order to prepare people for the job. So there needs to be a closer connection between what is taught, and we'll get to where it's taught in a second, and what jobs are going to be available. And you know, there's great emphasis on programs between universities and companies like Toyota, which place enormous numbers of kids, and they have a job waiting for them as long as they work part-time for the 4 years prior to that, as soon as they graduate. And that's sort of the wave of the future. And the bottom line is that education and employment can't be regarded as distinct issues in public policy. They have to be regarded as very closely linked. Now, speaking of 2016 and the election, you all recall that Senator Sanders was widely cheered and widely mocked for saying that higher education should be free. And I was thinking about this against the backdrop of the reading and talking that I've been doing about the impact of AI and related technologies. And it seems to me that there needs to be a smoother path to the acquisition of those slightly higher skills than we now possess for students who may not be, may not be headed to Harvard and Oxford as Tom was. And so I began thinking about how crazy is it to say that community colleges, for example, shouldn't be free to the student. And having had the benefit of presiding over the budgets for various forms of education, I seem to recall that that was not long money. That was relatively short money. So I looked into it just today, And come to find out, it would cost about $150 million if the state, even assuming no participation from the federal government, ponied up the money so that the community colleges could operate at their current level, and the state would make up the shortfall of tuition that the students would not then be paying. What possible role could charter schools play? Well, obviously the community colleges are going to have to be kind of agile in offering those programs and balancing their budget. And I associate charter schools with agility and innovation. And I can see that some charter schools in the upper grades might offer those very skills I'm talking about that are going to be required by the new economy that's impacted by AI and robotics. So I think that could be perhaps a tangy piece of catnip that we could hold out there as something where charter schools could be very important on a national issue of huge importance to the United States as we enter the new economy. So something to think about, but we are going to go back and hit the line again. Thank you very much.